ever since Donkey Kong, slithering down every pipe, despite his plum-shaped body type. Was born a running fear, while screaming Mamma Mia, who leaves me grey and grim. Oh, what does Peach see in him? Mario! With great joy in my heart, each time I watch Mario Kart, you're first and doing so well. But here comes this tiny shell. And now you and your rabby friends have finally met your end. Just let me catch my breath, then I'll see you to death. Who do you think you are? You should kneel on the star. You are nothing but a parody. I find your good role in a tragedy. It's a million nights ago, the only words you know. My art will touch your princess's heart, and you will be pulled apart. You think you'll win this tournament? I send you to retirement. You saw not worth the hustle. Your princess is none other cousin. Mushrooms won't end the pain. Time for the Santa to start his reign.
Hello and welcome to something totally different, even though it's kind of funny because the camera setting I have and the OBS settings I have is actually exactly the same as when I do a reading stream, but we're not doing that today. Today we are doing something I've wanted to do on this channel for a while. We're doing a podcast, and welcome to the Streaming Parson Podcast. I've entitled this first episode, How to Knowledge. And you're probably wondering, well, what the heck? What the heck does that mean, right? But, I mean, a simple way I mean, ironically, it ends up not being simple now that I have to explain it. But today we're going to talk about the fundamental, kind of like a epistemology for dummies, if you will. Now you're probably wondering, well, what the heck is epistemology? And epistemology is the study of the utility of knowledge and the value of knowledge, right? Now, I'll just do a little bit of history preamble of where epistemology comes from. And epistemology comes from basically during the golden age of Greece. So what's that, like 500-ish BC? And of course, you know, the golden age of Greece was all about many people discovering things and figuring out a lot of how the world works, figuring out a lot of what would eventually lead to more modern science. Of course, 500 BC, you can't really call it modern science, but, you know, a lot of things like the Pythagorean theorem and, you know, understanding how displacement works and various other mathematic and scientific principles that we use in the world today was when all these guys in the golden age of Greece in Athens, the city of Athens, were coming up with all these ideas and discoveries, right? And there was a massive growth in technological advancements because obviously of all these discoveries that they were making and figuring stuff out. And there was a massive influx of information, right, during the golden age of Greece. And that's probably why, that was exactly why it was called the golden age of Greece, was because there was so much knowledge and information. And then, of course, you know, one of the important things, and, you know, there's those philosophy memes. Maybe someone can whip one up for me, because I'm, one, already doing the podcast, and two, I don't want to be caught, like, plagiarizing this meme. But basically, there's a meme about, like, how as important of all the other studies are, philosophy is the science of science, right? And the idea is that, like, well, without philosophy, every other form of science barely has its validity. And the idea is that, like, well, science asks how things are done, right? How do things work, etc. And philosophy basically asks, well, why, right? And why do we bother with that? And so that's essentially the birth of epistemology, is the idea of, like, well, why do we bother with knowing what we know, right? And of course, with that said, you know, as I talk about a little bit of ancient Greece, you're probably wondering, what the heck does that have to do with us today? Well, how's the old saying go? You know, nothing is new under the sun. And in a funny way, similar to the golden age of Greece, you know, here we are in the 21st century with, well, I mean, before this decade, we've made a lot of advancements in technology, right? And, you know, I was having this funny talk about, like, how things that are no longer a thing, right? Like, Discmen are no longer a thing, right? The idea of, I was watching Star Trek, and you watch these guys with, like, their communication devices that look like crappy flip phones, and there's, like, plays, right? Intergalactic travel, and they're using flip phones. Of course, like, you know, when they made the original Star Trek, sorry, they had no idea that smartphones were going to be a thing, right? They had no idea, right? But here we are in the 21st century with, like, the advances of technology we have, and one of the biggest ones is the internet, right? And this is where kind of the big premise of talking about epistemology in today's podcast is going to come in, right? Because think of it like this. We live because of the internet, right? We live in a time where basically we can know anything. You can know anything. That's just the matter of the fact. You can know anything. You can look up whatever you want to know, and you can know something, right? There is nothing that you can't know because of the internet, right? And that's an amazing thing. That's a beautiful thing. But there's a caveat. Not all knowledge is equal. Right? There's such a thing as knowing things that are bad for you and things that are good for you. And there are things that are worth knowing and things that are not worth knowing. And of course, you know, as the human brain, your brain can only absorb so much information. It's one of those funny things where, you know, we can complain about the modern school education system, that one of its poor structures is that, like, well, there's a lot of overload to a lot of young minds, right? Because, you know, with a higher, what's that word? A higher diagnoses of, you know, teenagers especially having like attention crap. What is it actually called? ADHD, whatever ADHD actually stands for. I know it makes it sound like I don't know what I'm talking about when I don't know what ADHD stands for. But, you know, a higher diagnosis of ADHD in teenagers, right? And so you run into this problem of now there's too much information, right? So on the one hand, the internet is awesome because you can know anything. But the problem with that is now there's too much to know, right? And what do you not know, right? But at the same time, just because you can know something doesn't mean that everything is worth knowing about, right? And so that's kind of today that I kind of want to talk about, and to talk about. I know I call the title of the video "How to Knowledge," but really this is more me talking epistemology, and more importantly, well, my conclusions of how we should evaluate knowledge and how to move on in life with, you know, what we're going to talk about, which I know is kind of like a spoiler, but hey, this is the end of the preamble. Now we're actually going to talk about knowledge and how we should deal with knowledge and what we know, right? And so the first thing I kind of want to talk about why I think this is really important is because I spend a lot of time on, you know, Discord servers and, you know, finding, I guess you could say, my mission field, right? Part of, you know, I know that's Christianese for some of you, so I'll explain that a little bit. So basically, I'm a pastor, but I'm not really a pastor in the sense of, like, by definition, and my degree would suggest I'm a pastor, but, you know, I don't actually work at a church. I'm not in a pastoral leadership role or anything like that in the church. You know, I actually, as a matter of fact, I haven't gone to church for almost a year. Well, no, that's not true. There was a little time after that. Well, part of it was because of COVID, right? So you couldn't go to church. And even when churches reopen, only like go a little bit just to play on like the church band kind of thing once in a while. But that's been pretty inconsistent because I also work on Sundays. And then, of course, trying to find you know, looking around for pastoral work, you don't really commit to the church that you go to now, right? So like the one I go to now, I don't really like commit to it, right? Which I know is not the best model of how a pastor should go about things, because like you should always commit, right? But then at the same time, you don't want to overinvest, because what if I actually do land, you know, a pastor job somewhere else, and then I have to, if I actually made stronger connections with people at this one church I on and off go to now, then it's like, all right, see you later, right? And that's almost just as bad. So what I do is I hang around in various communities online, primarily Discord communities, and find people to talk about the gospel and Jesus Christ about it and stuff like that, right? That's not what I do. And that's also kind of why this channel exists, that I, you know, read the Bible to you, and I have made no secret that I talk about my religious faith openly. And of course, and at the end of the day, you know, I'm hoping that you too would have faith in Jesus Christ, right? But in my, outings, but not really outings, because I mean, I'm sitting in a chair looking at Discord servers. There's a lot of young people with very impressionable minds, and I have to say, you find them being, you find a lot of there's no nice way of saying this, but you know, teenagers being really stupid on the internet, right? And this is where we run into the issue of the topic I want to talk about: how to knowledge, how to evaluate what you know, and is it really worth knowing, right? Because when I say I find stupid teenagers on the internet, on the one hand, it's like, well, teenagers are stupid by definition, because what does a teenager know about life and anything for that matter? But on the other hand, some of these ideas that they've that have been impressed onto them, a lot of, because of the way our society is, and the way the media has told lies, and people talk about how like the modern education system is a lot of brainwashing to young people, etc., etc. You find that people say, and then of course there's the added problem of when you're on the internet, on like Discord, for example, and because you can make your online avatar, you can hide behind anonymity, right? No one knows who you really are. And so people can maybe feel they can get away with being like, just thinking stupid things or saying stupid things. And, then you have the extreme people who, they use that anonymity to be a different person that's all full of toxicity, right? Spewing out racist nonsense, or a good example is that I've seen guys like, I've gotten in trouble with Twitch, and this is how toxic the Twitch community is, and one reason why I used to actually do Twitch once upon a time, but I stopped doing that because people would actually get all like, how do I put it? They would all get up in my gears about like when I used to do my Bible reading streams on Twitch, right? Exactly the same way I do it on YouTube. Exactly, it's not like I'm a master of technology, so I kind of have a format, and I can't really change from the format because I don't know how to make it. I don't know how to change this, right? But just a guy reading a Bible on camera is what I was doing, right? Hey Sterling, welcome to the stream. Yes, we are talking about epistemology. Let me move the chat box. I don't know why I'm doing that. Give me a sec here. Oh, I remember why I did that. Okay, yeah, because if I put the chat here, the problem is the lighter background here. Well, we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll leave it over there for now. Yeah, we're essentially talking about epistemology, Sterling. Anyway, so going back to my problem with Twitch, right? So on Twitch, get on my case about like, oh, this guy's reading offensive material, just reading the Bible on stream, right? And I think I was reading like the book of Genesis or something on there. No, I wasn't. I think I was reading. It doesn't really matter what I was reading. I think I was reading Genesis, but anyway, besides the point. And then you look at other stuff on Twitch, and there's like people flat out with like anti-Semitism, right? Just like put in all their Nazi jokes. And, I mean, can you even call it a joke when it's like more or less promoting Nazism, right? And people just, all their sake friggin' hail, right? And stuff like that. And you're just like, are you for real, right? And how do people actually think this is okay, right? To think these kind of things, right? And so, with all, the internet having all these young people with very impressionable minds, and then you can have people just like spew anti-Semitism and brainwash young people, and to convince them that something like anti-Semitism is okay, right? Like, we've got to really figure out, as a community and as people, to figure out what kind of knowledges are and are not worth knowing, right? Now, of course, this isn't going to be like here's a list of things that are worth knowing and a list of things that are not worth knowing. Of course, obviously, when I give some examples of some points I'm going to make, they're kind of like things you should know and things you shouldn't know, right? So, the first thing, Sterling, you think all true things are worth knowing. Of course, I really like you brought that up, because that's actually one of the first things that we're going to talk about is what is true, right? Now, there's a certain acronym. I really need to make a graphic for this. I really should have done a bit more prep for this, but there's an acronym people like to use when it comes to the acronym is more used when it says, like, when you have something to say, you think, right? And the acronym is think. Now, if you know the acronym of think, it goes, before you speak, think. And the acronym goes like this. T is for, is it true? H is for, is it helpful? I is for, I'm trying to remember the acronym of think. T, is it true? H, is it helpful? I think is, does it inspire? Does it inspire, something like that? N is, so I'm gonna look this up now. The think acronym. All right, so the think acronym is. Whoops. No. What are you doing? I just have a picture of the image. No. Okay, I'm just gonna read it to you instead of like trying to put it up on here, because I don't want to get in trouble for plagiarizing someone's like fancy art thing. So it says, before you speak, think. T, is it true? H, is it helpful? I, is it inspiring? N, is it necessary? And K, is it kind? And that's absolutely true when you think about, like, before you say anything, right? You've got to consider all these things, because of course the underlying context of the acronym and the importance of thinking before you speak is because there's this idea that all our words are very important, right? Words are powerful, right? And so the acronym is meant to help us reflect on that, right? That your words are powerful, and so before you speak, you should consider all these things, if things are true, helpful, inspiring, necessary, and kind. With that being said, I'm willing to take that to the idea of knowledge itself, right? Knowledge itself needs to be considered in the same way with the acronym THINK. Is it true? Right? Factually, and this goes back to the ancient Greeks and what made, their study of epistemology so important, right? Because in Athens, the place where Greek philosophy was born, right? In Athens, the fundamental philosophy that they had when as they did all their scientific advancements, the fundamental thing that they thought was truth can only be known by what we observe and measure and test, right? That's how we can know truth. That's a fundamental idea of the rationale of the Renaissance and later on the Enlightenment, right? Is the resurrection of that idea that truth is something we can know by observation and measuring the world around us and to experiment, right? What is simply, right? That's how you define something as true. You can say it is, right? And knowledge works in the same way, right? Some things, people can spew out lies, and of course, there's another reason why truth is so important, because you can't have a society built on lies, right? And I mean, that's, if you play any of those, like, every Japanese RPG loves to play on that story, right? Of like societies that are built on lies and then watching that crumble down as the heroes, you know, unravel the big evil scheme, right? That the reason why the lies were built was to control this and that or to do this or whatever, right? And so truth is so important, right? And so, but but this is one of the things. This is one of the things that makes it tough, though, in this world with so much information out there. And of course, this is where this is interesting irony with how we tackle truth, right? So I made this little comment before about how, okay, one thing on the internet is that we can create a new persona for ourselves, right? A disguise, if you will, of who we are. And so, you know, no one really knows who you are on the internet, right? You can come with a totally fake ID and no one would be the wiser, right? And so with that being said, you know, you've essentially created a false narrative. And so if people are going around with these false narratives in front of themselves, right, to cover up who they really are, because one, you should protect your identity, and two, you know, who has any right to know the real you, right? I mean, that's a fair assessment to think. That's a fair thing to think. But then, with that being said, if you're going to go around deceiving people, you should expect that others will deceive you. And that's what makes taking knowledge on the internet very, very tricky and very, very difficult, right? Because, you know, for all you know, people may just be out there to just lie to you and to kind of pull your leg in every regard. Oops, sorry. Let me just fix my lighting here for a second. So, you know, Sterling, what you say, you would think that would be obvious, right? I read your comment there that truth and knowledge should be demonstrable, and you know, you would think that, right? Because that's the old-fashioned thinking, you know, the Athens philosophy, right? The idea that truth can be observed in the world, right? And you can measure, experiment, hypothesize, etc. You can do all that. You can do the scientific method, basically, right? I mean, the scientific method was basically developed from that idea. You would think that, right? But the problem with a place where you can basically know anything, the internet, is that you can make all kinds of other narratives that don't have to be true. And then, of course, the problem is how do we navigate what is true and what is not? And so, okay, so for all we know, the Bible could be pulling our leg too, right? How can we demonstrate that is true? Well, I've already mentioned this last time you asked me this question. And this can be said about a lot of things too, right? Is that, you know, people had tons and tons of like documentation that they saw the events that they saw. Of course, the problem for us in 2021 is we're pretty far away from those witnesses, right? So, and this is true of any like historical event. You could say, this is a dangerous example, but you could, since no one was alive during, I'm trying to think of like, what happened just before World War One, like an event before World War One, right? Because I don't know if there's anyone alive. I mean, can you believe World War One is over 100 years ago? Is there anyone still alive from World War One? Right? I don't think so. With no one being alive from World War One, people could make the argument that World War One didn't happen, right? Because there's no living witnesses. No one can say that that was an actual thing. We just assume because of like history has told us this, right? Any even older things, the Bible being one of them, any kind of like the unification of China is a good example, right? Did that really happen? Was Shi Huangdi a real person? Was the way he did things really how things went down? No, you can't actually measure that now because no one is alive from 3,000 plus years ago, right? When China became a thing, right? And so, sure, we have all the records of witnesses at the time, but you because we as we get further and further away from the origin of those events, it only gets harder to verify if something's true. And so, yeah, the Athens philosophy doesn't fully work in that regard. There's lots of evidence for World War One. Entire museums full of it. Yeah, but someone could just say someone, put those things together to entertain people. I mean, people on the flip side, there are many people who say the same dumb shit about like dinosaur museums, right? Right? Like no, right? But that the museum thing, it doesn't exactly work because people will always twist that. But the point I'm getting at, though, Sterling, World War One was not the best example, right? Because it's still 100 years is still relatively close. But the point I'm trying to make is as you go further and further back in time, of course, it gets more harder to actually measure that because there's nothing really around to really prove that, right? It's like the Great Library of Alexandria. No one can actually say that actually existed because, or we know it existed, but because everything was destroyed, do you doubt that it existed, right? The Great Library of Alexandria is a great example as well, right? The World War One wasn't the best example, but the point I'm trying to get at is because as we move through history, we get further and further away from the events that any idea was built on, right? And so as you get further away, it's harder to say definitively that like, oh yeah, this really happened, right? And so, do you require that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Well, of course, that's true about anything, right? You always need evidence for any case that's made, right? I don't think that's kind of a rhetorical question, and I feel stupid for actually answering that because it's rhetorical. That's how rhetorical questions work. But before you go on, Sterling, I think this is where we move on with the THINK acronym, right? Because yes, there are things that are, whether things are true or correct. You have to think about another part. There's more to knowledge than it being true. Of course, I know this can be a little dangerous because I'm not trying to say that this next thing can apply to something that's false, right? You cannot use a lie to push your agenda because that's dangerous. But another thing about knowledge that we must consider is it helpful? Does what knowledge you have actually help people and help yourself, right? So a Bible passage that kind of refers to this issue is there's I should have looked up which passage it is in the New Testament. The apostle Paul talks about this, where he talks about knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And the idea the context for that verse was the idea that there were Christians that would only, they would spew out all the knowledge that they know, right? And they would act like know-it-alls, just like anyone else would, right? And then Paul was criticizing that, saying, well, what's the point of you being a know-it-all, right? With what we know about the gospel and all that, shouldn't we be helping people? And so that's where Paul brings up that famous line, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And the idea was, what you know, you should be using that to help people. And so this is where I actually wanted to talk about this more, right? Of does your knowledge and how you apply your knowledge, shouldn't it help people and be a service to your community, to your family, and to others, and even and ultimately to yourself as well, right? Because it has to be helpful. What you know has to be useful, right? Because there's a lot of useless information out there, right? There is. And so you have to really analyze, and part of this is one of the problems of, one of the struggles, I shouldn't call it a problem. It's a struggle that a lot of young people have, and understandably so, of where they're going in life and the trajectory of which their life is moving toward, right? And so they're not sure of, the information they acquire, if it's going to help them acquire that goal, because a lot of young people don't have those goals. They don't have the aspirations needed of where they're going and what they want to do with their life. So when they acquire knowledge, they're not filtering out exactly what's going to help them reach those goals, because you can't filter out what's going to help you to your goals if you don't have concrete goals, right? And so that's one of the big things that I think is a bigger problem, is we don't think about what we know and knowledge that we acquire as how it can be helpful to others, right? And ultimately, and even to ourselves, right? Because that's one of the biggest problems, right? So I'll use a gaming example, right? So you watch some of these guys. I watch a lot of Fire Emblem videos and people who play Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem is a turn-based strategy game. As a matter of fact, one of the big Discord communities I hang out with is the Mecha community, and Mecha is a Fire Emblem YouTuber. He's pretty big, and he actually mentioned this as well, where, let's say he's playing through the game, right? He's doing a Fire Emblem Iron Man mode, and you go through the chats, and the chat's trying to be helpful. Now, when you say something in the chat, and it's like, okay, trying to help Mecha be a better player, and Mecha himself said, okay, don't tell me like a game mechanic, like, oh, this weapon works this way, because he already knows that, right? He already knows how this particular mechanic works. You saying it in the chat is not helpful, right? You're telling him something he already knows. And when people do that, then when people do that, then you're just kind of insulting his intelligence, right? You're insulting his intelligence, thinking that, like, oh, as a Fire Emblem player, you should know this, but it's like, I do know that, and you mentioning it to me again doesn't help, right? You have to be helpful, right? So what convinced you that the story of Jesus' resurrection is true? That is I know I'm going to give my answer, and people are going to hate this answer. You ready for it? It's because nobody would give their lives for that claim if it wasn't true, right? And history has shown us that many people were willing to die when people told them, no, say that this is not true. Many people were willing to give up their lives for, that claim, right? Because here's the funny thing. Who was it? I don't want to say it was Lewis, not C.S. Lewis. There was another thinker during that time period, and he was talking about something called the Waterloo Experiment. And the Waterloo Experiment was basically the idea that they were gonna get like all these really smart guys in Waterloo, and they were going to carry out this lie. They were all gonna believe this lie together. And they can do it. They can keep it up for 2 weeks, right? They can't keep up the lie for 2 weeks. But when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, people have strongly held on to this belief and were willing to give up their lives for it because they knew it to be true, right? And then people carried on that tradition for years, right? if it was a lie, eventually somebody would have said, you know what, enough of this, we're all going to stop doing this. Eventually, they all would have figured out to stop doing it if it was a lie. But no, since the time of, when the church started, people were willing to give their lives for it. And, this is one of those things, too. I was going to get to this idea when we come to inspiring, right? Think, is it inspiring? Because it motivated people in how they were to live, right? It motivated people in how to live. And they were motivated to live in a way that was helpful, going back with the THINK acronym, right? And so, here's the thing though, too, right? Because I have not seen anyone rise from the dead, and I don't think anyone has, right? The ability of resurrection is still in question for what we can observe in this world, right? And I know many people just love using that as a way to say, well, then therefore the Bible didn't happen, right? Because it doesn't happen today. Nobody comes back from the dead today. Therefore, nobody came back from the dead in the past, blah, 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 right? But the fact that people are willing to give their lives and they reorient their entirety of their life. No one would do that for a lie. Nobody would do that for a lie, right? You ever watch like any of those rom-coms with like the cheating boyfriend, and he tries to get back with his girlfriend, but after she dumped his dumb ass, and then everyone else calls the guy on bullshit when he's like, oh, but you changed me, whatever, right? Like bullshit, right? Like everybody knows that the ex-boyfriend is full of bullshit, right? And so I use that funny little analogy because, like, I don't think people would have changed and oriented their lives on a lie. And logically, we know that. No one would do that, right? Because that's ridiculous, right? And so the Occam's razor would be that it did happen and people were willing to give their lives for what they knew to be true. And then this is where we come up with the apostolic tradition. Of course, the second part, when I just said the apostolic tradition part, that part is a little shaky, understandable, right? The apostolic tradition part is shaky, understandable. But the fact that we know that people are willing to give their lives in that fashion, there must be at least merit to it. Even if it's not quote-unquote completely true, there's at least the other meritable parts, going back with the THINK acronym, right? Which is kind of what we're talking about today. That's the whole point of this podcast, right? So, did the terrorists of 9/11 give their lives in the name of Allah? Does martyrdom prove something is true? Yes and no, right? But once again, Sterling, I'm trying to paint a larger picture. I think the thing now I'm criticizing you a bit about this, but I think you're too focused on only one part of the THINK acronym, right? Because once again, this is what I mean by it has to be more than just true, right? Because there's a lot of things that are true in life that we don't care about, right? Here's a fun example. I don't know where you live, Sterling. I live in Canada. And in Canada, in 2 weeks from now, we are having an election in 2 weeks. And if you read all the election platforms, they're all really terrible. Because you can tell by the policies that they're all kind of half-assed. And to be fair, the election that we're having in 2 weeks was kind of like a random call that Justin Trudeau wanted to do. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of brains that for Justin Trudeau to call this election is idiotic. It's really stupid. And because of this, it just adds on to the fact that we know Justin Trudeau is actually pretty terrible prime minister. He's actually pretty terrible. I know I'm political views on YouTube. But it's like calling an election like this is idiotic. It's beyond idiotic, right? You're wasting people's time. You're wasting their money. You're you're telling people to do something for no real reason, etc. Right? So people know for a fact that like our current prime minister is an idiot, right? It is a fact, right? You like going back to the Greek philosophy of observable, yeah, you can see it, like, right? So, but do people care? There's going to be tons of people who still vote for him. You know, there's a likelihood he may win, maybe not a majority government, but he's definitely going to remain prime minister more than likely. Because just because it's true, he's clearly an idiot. Do people care? Right? You know, I don't care. Right? Just because something is true doesn't automatically mean people have to. Doesn't mean that it has to matter. Right? So then you have to get to the other parts of the THINK acronym, and this is where I think once again it's important to analyze all these elements when it comes to what knowledge is worth knowing, right? And so now you're bringing Islam as an example, and I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're trying to do. But I'm gonna go through, the THINK acronym, and then we'll think about these kind of things, right? So is it helpful? How does it inspire? How does it help people, right? And of course, is it inspiring, right? How to, well, inspiring and helpful are like they work hand in hand together. So I guess we're gonna talk about the both of them together like this because I already mentioned the helpful part of it. And I see your comment there about how like Muhammad inspired people and helped them to live their life. That's not what I read from the Sahunis, right? Of course, now I know the criticism I'll get when I say I've read like the Hadith and whatever. I've only read a translation, and I know somebody's gonna give me shit by saying, "Well, you have to read in Arabic," which is problematic because I can't read Arabic. But I like to think a translation would be adequate, right? But besides the point. So when we talk about how if something is inspiring, right? You have to think about of what you know, does it lead you to be more than you are, right? And so religious texts tend to do this. That's actually more often than not. That's what a lot of people say about something is inspiring, right? So your Muslim friend says Muhammad is the most inspiring man in history. Not from what I've read. And let me ask you something, Sterling. Have you read for yourself? And that's another important thing, because you may be very well falling into this exact problem that I've been mentioning about this whole epistemology thing, right? It's one thing for someone to say something. It's something else for you to come to your conclusions about something based on what you have read, what you've observed, right? Because once again, you brought up the idea of like you and I must observe these things, and you're absolutely right, right? But see, when you say something and I'm now saying the opposite, right? The question is what do you know, right? Not what someone else has told you, because now you're in the middle of two people saying two different things, right? So the question is, what do you know? And then it goes to the I part. Well, does that inspire you? And that's something you have to deal with, right? And so when I was going to talk about the inspirational part, I was going to talk about the modern, the comic book industry and comic book stories, right? Inspirations, right? Well, why do we have comic books, right? The idea of the comic book was that in a place like America, where there wasn't a single unifying mythology, because you have a bunch of different people from different parts of the world, and everyone has their own religious beliefs and their own stories. If you wanted to make an American culture, you have to make your own set of mythology, and that's where comic books come in, right? And so the comic book characters have to inspire something into what is the American culture, right? And of course, Superman is the kind of apex of that, right? Truth, justice, and the American way, right? So, that's the whole Superman shtick, right? And the whole idea of the comic book mythology was to reinstill characters that would bring inspiration to people, right? And of course, that's why a lot of the comic book characters have their, trademark inspirational lines, right? And Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility, and so on, right? And the idea is what must inspire you and must inspire your culture, right? And that's another thing too that we have to get into when we go in with the THINK acronym, right? Is that it can't only be like a personal thing. It can't personally be true. It can't only be personally helpful. It can't only be personally inspiring. Obviously, those are important, but it needs to be true for your society, your community, and by extension, your society. It must be helpful to your community and by extension, your society. Is it inspiring? It must be inspiring to your community and to your society, and by extension, your society, right? It has to branch out a lot more than what you and I can personally observe. And that's really the crux of what will make knowledge valuable. Now, of course, this is not easy. This is not easy. You're simply pointing out that your truth acronym doesn't seem to get to the truth if it can be applied to Muhammad. It's just simply pointing out that your truth acronym doesn't seem to get to the truth if it can be applied. Well, there you're running into other problems, right? Because, well, I just said that maybe Muhammad is not as inspiring as people think he is, because I've read the Hadith, and the Hadith says something very different from what I would think is an inspirational person. I don't think screwing a 9-year-old girl would be a model citizen in my perspective. So there's that. Oh, sorry. Phone thing here. Don't worry about it. But this is where, once again, the think thing is so important, right? Because it has to be true in a much larger, scope than like what you and I personally think is true, right? So that's where the H and the I come in, the think part, right? Sorry. I gotta mute this for a second. Okay. Sorry, someone was just phoning about insurance stuff. Not for me, though, because I'm not an insurance broker. Someone else in the house is, though. But that's besides the point. It seems quite subjective, you say. Well, this is where the struggle of being human beings is, you're pointing out the struggle of being a bunch of human beings living together, right? And that's, society in a nutshell. It's a bunch of people who may think, believe, and understand the world differently from each other. You understand the world differently from most people you know, right? I understand the world very differently from most of the people I know. But when it comes to how we evaluate knowledge that's worth knowing and not worth knowing, it fundamentally comes down to, well, there's something that is more important than your personal convictions most of the time, right? And that is, how do we as a society live in harmony, right? That goes back to the think thing, right? We as a people must live in harmony, and that is not easy. And so the way we acquire and apply knowledge must maintain that. Hang on. Why? He's not home. 摸我一下。没有摸谁。No. Okay. All right. Bye. Sorry. If I didn't tell him he wasn't home, he would keep calling for the next hour nonstop. Okay. So I had to like say he's not here. Right. So. Okay. Now that we got, hopefully, he'll leave us alone for a while. So. No, I almost lost my train of thought. Okay, so. The thing about what knowledge needs to do. Now, when you get to us having this truth discussion, you're kind of missing the point of what the point of epistemology is. Right? Because remember, the title of this video is not what is truth. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about how we apply knowledge. How do we apply what we know? And my fundamental thesis, I was hoping to say this at the end, but you've kind of forced my hand to say it now, is how knowledge should work is that it betters all of us as a community, and that it allows us to be good to each other and to help each other and to build each other up as people, right? That's ultimately how knowledge should work, right? And so that's why we have to balance things of just being right all the time, right? Because if you only focus on what is true and you get this idea of you have to be right all the time, right? Then you end up picking battles that you shouldn't need to pick, right? Instead of allowing people to come to an understanding to things that are true, if you're too occupied with saying, no, I know what's true and I have to be right about it, that doesn't help, right? Of course, you can't be helpful by telling lies. So, you have to balance those things too, right? Being helpful and maintaining to what is true. You want to inspire people, but inspiration has to be from this idea that it can help other people. Inspiration has to be able to apply to everybody, that everybody can become more than what they are, right? Which then moves us to the next part of the acronym. Is it necessary, right? Is the type of knowledge that you encounter, is that necessary, right? Is it necessary to fulfill the other requirements, right? Of it being right in how someone lives. Is it necessary for how people can help one another, right? Or how we can inspire one another as people, right? Is it necessary then? All those necessities met. And so when it comes to knowledge, right, you have to consider if something is truly necessary, right? And is it necessary to know in order to achieve those other things, right? Is it necessary to know, the kind of person a historical figure we look up to is in order to achieve those other goals, right? And then finally we get to, is it kind, right? Because ultimately, when you as a human being have to live with a bunch of other human beings, right, which ain't easy, but even though it's not easy to live with and get along with other human beings, fundamentally you kind of have to live with each other and have to work together, right? And so being kind is a big part of that, right? And so does the knowledge you have display that kind of kindness that can maintain harmony between people, right? And so these are things we have to consider, not just when we speak words, and I've spoken a lot of them in this last hour, as you can obviously tell, but kind of where I want to go from here, right? And this is why I felt like a good first episode of this Streaming Parson podcast is to go over this kind of thing, is because no lies, man, like we're gonna have some idiotic like shenanigans in here, or I'm gonna have like guest speakers, we're gonna talk mad shit and whatever, right? We're gonna talk about stupid things, we're gonna talk about serious things, right? But in any of those conversations, in any of those future podcasts, any kind of conversation, whether they're from stupid and silly to, you know, starkingly serious, I think this is the think acronym always applies. And it doesn't just apply to the words we use, but it applies to the kinds of knowledge we acquire and how we apply them to our life, right? Because as you move forward in life, right, and as you get older, oh man, I make myself sound like I'm some kind of like village elder guru kind of old guy, right? But as you move on, as you move forward in life, and you get wiser, at least that's the idea. You know, the idea is your life experiences come from how you apply these very important principles, right? How you apply, you know, whether things are true, whether things are helpful, whether things are inspirational, whether they're necessary, whether they're kind, right? You have to always consider these things when it comes to knowing anything, right? And the thing I wish to foster in you is that, you know, as you guys are moving into your young adult lives, that we can harness this. We can harness, you know, all the information influx that you have, because that's true when even as you get older, right? But as a guy who has life experience, I like to think that I can help you, and then we can tackle this together, because you know there's a reason why we look to people, and that's why people have role models, right? Role models are meant to be people who have gone through the kind of experiences that you are going through, and then you can look up to your role models and say like, okay, what what have you done and how will that help me, right? And that goes back to true, you know, right, the knowing part. You know what's true about your role model's life, for example, and then how does it help, and are you inspired, right? And those kind of things. Hey Nathaniel, welcome to the stream. So that's kind of the main thing I wanted to really get at, is for us to really think about why do we know what we know, and is it going to be helpful as we move forward in life. So, you know, there's this, you know, it's a funny thing. I know we were talking about, like, when you were trying to ask me, you know, what is it about the resurrection that's so convincing or whatever, right? It's because it fulfills all these things, essentially, right? People would not die for a lie. Is it helpful? Well, people reorient their lives to be better people. Is it inspiring? Hell yeah, it's inspiring, right? If there is more to life than eating, getting fat, enjoying what little you can, and then dying, if there's more to life than that, then yeah, there's more to live for in life, right? Is it necessary? Well, the idea that people can live after death is a necessary idea for those other things to matter, right? That someone can rise from the dead, that people can orient their lives to be fruitful and to live their life fully. And is it kind? Forgiveness is one of the kindest things you can do for someone, to forgive, right? And the resurrection of Jesus fulfills all 5 requirements. And so those are the kind of things we have to consider, right? And you know, the funny thing, a great example of, you know, you apply all these things, the think acronym, right? I even say to people, like, even if you're not a Christian, read the Bible, because a lot of the principles, they're designed to teach people how to be nice to each other. That's fundamentally the Bible's goal. Even if you don't believe that there's a God, you can still understand that if there was one, he would want people to be nice to each other, as opposed to, you know, you think of old tribal religions that don't care if people are nice to each other. As a matter of fact, their whole business is, you know, subjugate all the weak so that I am declared the greatest God, right? Like, those are very different. Those are fundamentally very different ideas. And so that was another reason why Christianity exploded like it did, right? Was because of the idea that, like, oh, God actually wants us to be nice to each other? That's a revolutionary idea, right? And so that was one reason why Christianity survived as long as it did, right? Because a lot of the other religions in the world at that time, and for a long part of history, taught something very different. But when people were inspired to be like, oh, we should actually be nice to each other, that sounds that sounds like a great idea, right? We should be nice to each other, and so let's do that, right? And that was fundamentally what the Bible was after. And so I would make the argument that, yeah, it is worth knowing in that regard, right? And not just worth knowing, because, for example, I know I've done many studies of other religions for the sake of not knowing when I have to talk to, well, anyone, right? Because you don't want to look like an idiot if I have to talk to a person of a different religion when I'm trying to talk about Jesus with them, right? So there's that. But when I talk about, like, how epistemology works, and I try to avoid using that word too much, right? But basically, one of the things that we really need to consider when we're really, it's more than just knowing. And I think that's the other thing about knowledge that people tend to forget about. And this goes back to whether knowledge has to be more than just true, right? It has to fulfill all the other requirements of the THINK acronym. Because if it's just about knowing things, well then, this goes back to the beginning of the problem that I was talking about. Hello, Emily. Welcome to the stream. Hey, it's great that you found me. We can hang out here, and I'm still talking about the how-to knowledge. But one of the things that we forget about when it comes to, or let me bash out a bit because I got distracted by the chat a little bit. It goes back to the problem I brought up at the beginning. We live in a period in time where you can know anything. The internet has made it so that you can know basically anything. But what is worth knowing, right? And I like to think, now, of course, once again, this is me more talking now as opposed to us analyzing things. But this is where I want you to think about these things too, right? I want you to think about these things. But what makes knowledge important in my mind, and what makes something worth knowing, is, one, does it matter in how I live? And two, does how I live help people fundamentally, right? I should be oriented to help other people, right? And, helping myself a little bit on the side. But, the idea is that I can't really help myself if I'm not helping other people fundamentally. Because, of course, I have to share this planet with the rest of you, right? And vice versa, we have to share this world with each other. And so we should really learn how to operate in this world together. And I think that should be the fundamental part of what makes knowledge worth knowing. Because there's a lot of things we can know, right? Like, I know I could probably recite, the Macbeth play by memory. Okay, maybe not. Maybe not by now. I've probably forgotten like a good chunk of it. But I could recite a lot of it by memory. But there's one thing of knowing something, like, oh, I can recite Shakespeare to you. But is it helpful, right? Does it matter to us living as a society? Not really, right? So there's some information that's kind of like, yeah, it's good to have, but like, whatever, right? But real knowledge and how to really apply knowledge should be used in a way that we help each other and that we make each other better. And I think that should be our primary aims. And I'm hoping that to be the primary aim of this podcast series as we do that. Is that, we're going to have some shits and giggles, and we're going to have some serious conversations. But, excuse me, whoa. But fundamentally, I hope to foster in all of you, a way to critically move forward in life and to really apply what you know, right? Because it's so easy to just get caught up and be an incel, stuck in your computer chair, acquire all the information, and then do nothing, right? But then at that point, why even bother, right? So I like to believe that, we acquire knowledge so that we can apply it in our lives to help people. And so that's what we should be doing. And, there are different ways of understanding that. And that's the journey of of getting older, of maturing, is to filter out, what are the things that will allow me to do that, right? That will allow me to be a better person, to help people more, etc., etc., right? And so that's the fundamental question that was asked since the Greeks when epistemology was born, right? Was, well, how do we make society better, right? How do we make people better, right? Because people are, the society is the people, right? So how do you make people better? And I really believe that, that's something we need to foster together. And one of the troubles of the internet age, as I've mentioned earlier, is that it's so easy to get caught up in the knowledge itself, but then forget how to apply it and to move forward in your life with that knowledge, right? And with knowledge that will help you, right? So that's ultimately what I wanted to talk about today. And I want you guys to kind of think about these kind of things. And as we go through future weeks of podcasts, we're going to do our next one next week, and I will probably do another solo one kind of like today. Although, Sterling, you were helpful in, fostering some of the conversation. So thank you for that. But, I'll have guest speakers in the future as well, and we'll talk about all kinds of crazy topics, right? Because for the most part, anything is fair game here, right? We talk about video games. We're going to talk about ridiculous writing mechanics. We're going to talk about story tropes. We're going to talk about philosophy. We're going to talk about all kinds of things on here. But at the same time, as you can know anything on the internet, but how you live out what you know and how you live out a way that's helpful and kind and necessary and inspiring and true to people's lives, that's the part we're here to figure out together and to move forward together and to grow together, right? Because I think that's something that is not easy. We can't do it on our own. I mean, if we could, then everybody would have done it already, right? So I think that's something that we can go forward as a group together. I think that's something I wish to foster here, right? So yeah, that's basically all I have to say about that. That's how to knowledge. At least the basics of it anyways, because obviously, you get to the hard part, right? And that is how you deal with individual topics. Because, I mean, I'm just talking with a very, very broad brush. And that's a lot of ground to cover, right? So, but, future streams will be designed for, how we address particular things. And I want you guys to always keep this in mind, right? As we go through any of the future conversations that we have, right? How does our knowledge, or a better way of wording it is, does what I know matter, right? And does what you know matter as we move forward? And that's the big question we're going to tackle with all the different topics, right? What does it matter? Does it matter in how I live? Does it matter in how we affect each other's lives, etc.? All right, so that's the end of that. Just do some housekeeping. before we end the stream. So this week is going to be pretty light. It's funny because I'm not the one going back to school, but I'm still going to treat this week kind of like a tutorial week. You know, it's going to be pretty light. I'm not going to do anything on Wednesday. I'm not going to be here on Wednesday. Mainly because, like, I'm hoping not to be in a bad mood when I finish my dental appointment. This is the reason why people hate going to the dentist. I gotta go to the dentist on Wednesday, and hopefully that doesn't, you know, end up costing too much, and I hope I don't have any cavities and all that. Oh, right. So we'll see. But since with that being said, I know this week's gonna be pretty light, and I won't do anything else on the channel till Thursday. So Thursday we have Throwback Thursday with Heroes of Might Magic 2. And then Friday, we will begin our next Bible reading stream series, which we'll be reading through the Book of Kings, as I feel it's a natural progression after reading the Book of Samuel. Of course, don't worry as much as I did with Samuel. Now, I know with the Book of Samuel, it was way more studious with that one. But the Kings one, I don't feel is as, like, study intensive. So I'm hoping that one goes a lot smoother. Because I know, like, when I did the Samuel one, there was just, like, I threw a lot of information at you, right? Whereas, like, with the Book of Kings, and that's why the series probably won't be as long either, because we're just going to read through it. I'll mention some, like, story tropes and whatever. And, of course, answering questions and whatnot. So, yeah, this week's going to be pretty relaxed, right? Throwback Thursday on Thursdays. And then we begin the Book of Kings on Friday. At 3 o'clock Pacific time. Yes. At 3 o'clock Pacific time. We'll start the Book of Kings. So, that's going to be this week. And then next week, we'll have our next podcast on Monday at 4 o'clock. I know I started a little bit late today. But I'll try and be a little better on time. At least. That's going to be one of the things I'll improve, right? Because hopefully this podcast will evolve to, like, more than just, you know, this kind of thing, right? Just me sitting here like this and rambling. Hopefully, you know, there'll be more we can do. Whoops. Wow, that was a fail and a half. Anyway. That's all I have to say for today. Hope you guys enjoyed our first podcast of How to Knowledge. Thanks for sharing, Michael. No problem, Nathaniel. That's kind of why I do this, right? Is that I want to foster... I use that word a lot. But I want to foster, you know, growth. And help, you know... This makes it sound so old when I say it like this. But, like, you know, to help a lot of you guys that are a lot younger, right? Because I'm old, you know, with my cane and everything, right? I don't have a cane, I swear. But, hey, Nawani, welcome to the end. Because we're about to end it pretty soon. Yeah, so, the plan for next week, we'll just do episode 2 of the podcast. Hopefully I will be on time better. I was a little late today. That's why we went a little bit long. Well, no, I guess I would end normally about now. But on top of that, then we'll have more Throwback Thursday. We will play something next Wednesday. I don't know what yet, but it'll be pretty casual. I'm not going to do like a game series or anything like that. But I'll mention it again of why I'm not doing a game series for a while, because I've already done like 5 games on this channel, dude. Like 5 full playthroughs on this channel in the last year. 2021. Like, I played a lot in 2021. I mean, you go watch my playback videos. Like, I played Tokyo Mirage. I played Fire Emblem 3 Houses. Blue Lions were out. So, Dimitri. That came out wrong. Or did it? I played StarCraft 2. I played Bravely Default 2. And then I played Mario and Rabbids, right? So... If there was one RPG... Dude, I am not playing Neptune series. You know how long that's gonna take, dude? I already know that that would be like mayhem and a half. I am not doing that because I know how long it's gonna take, dude. Because the Neptuna series is one of those things where it's like, you can't play just one. Each one is like an 80-hour game, right? There's like 6 of them in the Neptuna series. Yeah, that ain't happening, right? Even if I committed the whole year, I wouldn't be able to finish it, right? Like, it would take that long. At that point, we would start getting bored, right? So, that's one of the problems of certain game series to, like, stream as well. But, I already know, man. I'm not doing Neptuna for that reason. I played a little bit of the first one. My brother was playing it, so I played a little bit. And it's fun, but, like, one, it's a bit too weebish. And 2, like, it's so time consuming. It's like, it's almost as bad as like Final Fantasy 12, dude. That game is pretty bad when it comes to just sucking up time like a vacuum cleaner in my car. Nah, that's a weird analogy, but you know what I mean. But anyway, so that's gonna be how it looks for the next couple weeks, you know. Another funny thing too of why I wanted to start off with like this, how do I put it, this how-to knowledge. You know, a lot of you guys are going back to school, right? And you're gonna be just more in flooding of knowledge. But as you guys learn stuff in school, read stuff on the internet, watch podcasts and whatever, right? I want you guys to always keep in mind, you know, how do you move forward in life and how do you make yourself a contributor to your community and to your society with what you know, right? And so that's something that we will all keep thinking about, and you know, we're all in this together, right? Anyway, this could be the end of the stream. You guys have a great rest of your day. You guys have great start of your week, and as we move through the week, I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you guys later this week for Throwback Thursday, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Leave a like, subscribe, and God bless you. See you next time.